August 16th, 2011. It's a tranquil Tuesday in Boonton, New Jersey, a bedroom community 30 miles west of Manhattan.
It's a very small and tight-knit community where everybody just kind of looks out for each other.
It's sort of a melting pot. It has a large Pakistani-American community that's been there for 50, 60 years.
The majority of the town are people of Islamic faith.
And for Boonton's Islamic residents, it's a particularly special time of year, the holy month of Ramadan.
Ramadan is a month of reflection, and we do a lot of good in that month, encouraged to help the needy, and we are obligated to fast. It's very common for people to break fast at sunset together.
Around 11 p.m., Ramadan festivities are wrapping up, and families are settling in for a quiet night. But a frantic 911 call from 26-year-old Kashif Pervez shatters the evening's calm.
Hello? 911, where's the emergency? I just got shot in my leg. Send an ambulance.
911 operators immediately dispatched Boonton police and medical to Kashif's location.
When first responders arrive, they're shocked to find what appears to be a young family gunned down in the middle of the quiet street.
Someone help her, please!
Thankfully, the baby's not harmed, not a scratch on him.
One officer immediately took the baby to the police cruiser to keep him safe.
What happened? Who did this to you?
I don't know. They ran away.
Thankfully, it appears that Kashif's injuries are non-life-threatening.
He was shot in the arm and the leg.
However, Kashif's wife, Nazish Noorani, isn't as fortunate.
Nazish was shot 3 times in the heart.
And they knew that it was probably too much for her body to take.
26-year-old Nazish Noorani had immigrated to the United States from Pakistan when she was just a teenager.
She was bubbly, she was very pretty, she dressed very well, she had a smile that could light up a room.
Nazish was a social butterfly, and because she was connected to her culture, she enjoyed attending cultural events.
And it was at one such event in 2005 that she met Kashif Pervez.
Kashif was also Pakistani, but he was born and raised here in the U.S.
Kashif was a very handsome young man coming from a very wealthy family. He had class, he had flair.
Kashif dreamed of being an architect, and he told Nazish that he was working on a master's degree at the prestigious Columbia University in New York City.
Kashif represented everything she would want in a husband.
Just months after meeting each other, the pair tied the knot and settled in Brooklyn, so Kashif could finish his studies at Columbia. And before long, their family of 2 started to grow.
Nazish and Kashif welcomed their first son in 2006 and their second one soon after.
She was just a loving mom who did everything to take care of her family and just be supportive of her husband in his dream to be an architect.
And as Kashif neared the end of his master's program, he got some more exciting news.
Babe. I got in. Look.
Harvard?
Yeah.
Oh my God. I'm so proud of you.
Kashif was offered an amazing opportunity to go to Harvard University.
Well, what does this mean for us?
Well, no reason to uproot the boys.
The plan was for Kashif to move to Boston and attend Harvard, while Nazish and the boys stayed back in Brooklyn.
Right, of course. You go. We'll be fine. It's only temporary.
Kashif and Nazish were willing to make the sacrifices necessary for them to have the life of their dreams.
And on August 16th, they reunited in Boonton, New Jersey to celebrate Ramadan with extended family.
Ramadan is a very happy time for the Muslim community.
But now, what started as a celebration has turned into a nightmare.
Nazish Noorani was dying on the street after having been shot in the heart.
Unfortunately, there's nothing paramedics can do to save Nazish's life.
No pulse.
No!
She's gone.
Oh, God! No!
The bullets that struck her right in the chest.
Who would want to kill this beautiful young mother? And why?
Mr. Pervez tells first responders that they were ambushed by 3 gunmen wearing masks.
This wasn't random. They were profiling us.
Kashif says before the gunmen opened fire, they shouted something chilling.
They called them terrorists.
This was very serious. This was a possible hate crime.
Pakistani native Nazish Noorani had built a good life for herself in the U.S., along with her architect husband, Kashif Pervez, and their 2 young sons.
She was very devoted to her sons. They were the focus of her life, as well as her husband.
But now Nazish and Kashif have been gunned down by a group of masked attackers.
The wife was pronounced dead on the scene.
Kashif believes the violence was racially motivated.
This wasn't random. They were profiling us. They called us terrorists.
For police, this is a concerning piece of information.
It's the middle of Ramadan, the holiest month of the year for the Muslim community.
Because of Kashif and Nazish's Pakistani heritage, as well as their Muslim faith, this was something that police had to consider a possible hate crime.
Can't give any other descriptions on these guys. We'll need to know what to look for later.
There was 3 of them. One was black, one was white. That's all I know.
As first responders prepare to transport Kashif to the hospital, he walks them through the events of that evening.
He said they were in Bhutan that particular night to celebrate Ramadan with family.
After dinner, he says he and Nazish decided to take a stroll through the neighborhood with their baby. Their oldest son chose to stay behind with Nazish's family.
Kashif says as they left his sister-in-law's house, everything seemed normal. But moments later, chaos erupted.
He said 3 masked men approached him. One was white, one was black, and he couldn't tell the other.
Please don't shoot. We don't have any money.
We don't want your money. We want you to go back to where you came from.
He said it hadn't been a robbery. It was targeted.
Kashif says before he had time to react and protect his wife and son, the masked men opened fire on them.
Go home, terrorists.
Kashif says the men took off, and he didn't see where they went.
At this point, Kashif was taken to the hospital as a result of the wounds that he received from this incident.
With the scene now secured, homicide detectives arrive to begin their investigation.
There really wasn't much evidence. There were some shell casings, but nothing else that really led the police in any particular direction.
The shell casings are clearly from 2 different firearms, a .38 caliber and 9mm, which fits with Kashif's statement that there were at least 2 shooters.
Comparing Nazish's wounds to Kashif's, it appears she was shot in the chest 3 times with a .38, which is a much larger bullet. There was no chance she was going to survive.
So was this indeed a hate crime? Were Kashif and Nazish targeted simply because of their Muslim faith?
Boomtown is a town where the Muslim community felt safe.
So police took this extremely serious. They wanted to make sure that no one else was in danger of being harmed because of this potential hate crime.
Just then, Nazish's family members arrive on the scene.
Nazish, where is she? Where's Kashif?
Kashif is in the hospital, ma'am. He's gonna be okay. But Nazish,
Please don't tell me that's her.
I'm so sorry.
The family was devastated. They had just seen her a few minutes ago. It was a very, very emotional moment.
They're experiencing the tragic loss of Nazish. She was a doting mom, a beautiful mom, a talented mom.
She was a wonderful person, you know, really the light of their family.
Had Nazish or her husband been experiencing any racial prejudice that you're aware of?
What? No, never.
We always felt so safe in this neighborhood.
Things like this do not happen in Bhutan, and certainly doesn't happen to people like Nazish and Kashif. It just didn't make sense. There had to be more to this story.
Can you think of anyone that would have wanted to harm Nazish?
No, everyone loved Nazish.
I mean, almost everyone.
Nazish's family had some major concerns and suspicions.
Take a look at this.
Nazish sent a text message to her brother a couple of months ago that stated, "Someday you will find me dead. It will be Kashif. He wants to kill me."
Detectives in Boonton, New Jersey have just begun their investigation into the shooting of mother of two, Nazish Noorani, and her surviving husband, Kashif Pervez.
According to Nazish's husband, Kashif, the couple was shot by 3 bigoted strangers. But the family isn't so sure.
Police have just learned that Nazish's relationship with Kashif was on the rocks, so much so that he may have even wanted her dead.
Take a look at this.
Nazish actually sent a text message to her brother a couple of months ago that stated, "Someday you will find me dead. It will be Kashif. He wants to kill me."
When Kashif went to Harvard, he never came back as much as he said he would. Because Nazish thought that something was up.
Family tells detectives that while Kashif was living in Boston to go to Harvard, Nazish had started to suspect him of having an affair.
I knew it.
She saw something on social media with Kashif and another woman.
Kashif, who is Sarah?
I don't know anyone named Sarah.
Oh yeah, then who is this?
Oh, she's just a friend.
A friend? A friend? Don't lie to me, Kashif.
When Nazish confronts Kashif, Kashif flew off the handle.
I've never lied. Stop accusing me of lying.
That's when the confrontation took a nasty turn.
She was punched in the stomach by Kashif.
I'm your husband. Never accuse me of lying.
Since the violent confrontation, Nazish's family says that she had grown terrified of Kashif.
Now, just because Kashif had hit his wife in the past, would he really go as far as to kill her? As well as shoot himself and try to cover it up?
Thank you for the information. We'll be in touch when we have more. Again, we're so sorry for your loss.
At this point, the detectives know that they need to talk with Kashif as soon as possible.
Detectives head to the hospital, where Kashif is currently receiving treatment for his injuries.
Kashif agrees to speak to detectives in his hospital room, and he starts out by repeating the same story he told officers on the scene.
He says the perpetrators of this offense approached him and his wife, called them terrorists.
However, as Kashif tells his story, detectives start to pick up on some inconsistencies with his initial statement.
So now Kashif indicates that the assailants, in this particular case, were all black men. So eyebrows went up with the investigators.
This is not what he said when he was first interviewed, so detectives are puzzled as to why Kashif's story changed so quickly.
When confronted, Kashif feels the heat and abruptly changes the subject to his wife, Nazish.
Kashif has a lot of negative things to say about Nazish. He really assassinated her character.
He's speaking about how selfish Nazish is and the fact that she always wants money.
You indicated there was always problems about money. She always wanted money, wanted you to give her all your money. Is that accurate? Right.
And when detectives ask Kashif about his alleged affair, he doesn't even attempt to deny it.
He tells them that Nazish drove him to cheat and that he had been involved with another woman named Sarah Khan for the last 5 years.
And you indicated to me that you really should not have gotten married. Right.
Suddenly, Kashif starts to break down and confess.
That's when the whole investigation changed.
He starts to tell the detectives that he doesn't want to go to jail, that he never meant for his wife to die.
You did not intend for this to happen. Obviously not. This will never happen.
In a Boonton, New Jersey hospital room, 26-year-old Kashif Pervez is finally revealing what really happened to his murdered wife, Nazish Noorani.
During this interview with the detectives, Kashif finally admitted that he was cheating.
He admitted that he hated his wife and wished they weren't together. But Kashif says that what happened last night was all a terrible accident.
You did not intend for this to happen. Obviously not. This will never happen.
Kashif now admits there were no masked assailants. There was no hate crime. He made it all up.
Kashif states, it's this guy, his name is Nomito. He did it. He killed her.
Kashif explains that Nomito is a truck driver he knows from Brooklyn.
I'm having a conversation with a friend of yours in Brooklyn, is that right?
Kashif explains he would often confide in Nomi about his problems.
He tells Nomi that he's having an affair, that his wife spends all his money, he doesn't love her anymore.
Kashif says he told Nomi that Nazish was standing in the way of his true love, Sarah Khan.
I mean, you know I can help you.
What do you mean?
Kashif says that's when Nomi made a shocking proposal.
I can help you get out. I'm good.
He would help him by getting rid of Nazish, by ending her life.
He says Nomi didn't even ask for money or anything in return. And Kashif was so desperate to get away from Nazish that he took him up on his offer.
Was there any room when you and this person that you would go out for a walk with your wife? Yeah. Okay. And this person would come out, kill your wife, and ruin you. Right.
However, Kashif says that when the evening of August 16th rolled around, he started having second thoughts.
He immediately regretted that they had plotted this murder.
But it was too late.
Wait, no, change your plans! Wait! No!
Kashif tells detectives that they decided that he should be shot too, so that it would seem as if he was not involved in this crime.
Come on, man, you ready? Come on, man, let's go.
And now that it's all over and Nazish is dead, Kashif says he wishes he'd never gotten involved with Nomi To.
Kashif is telling detectives that he was really coerced by Nomi into committing this crime, that Nomi was the mastermind.
Based on what Kashif has told them, detectives need to find Nomi To. But Kashif doesn't give them much to work with.
He explains that Nomi To is the man's nickname because he's a tow truck driver. He doesn't know the man's real name.
Despite his confession, they need to allow Kashif to heal before they can arrest him and take him to jail. So for now, they decide to try and track down Nomi
To. Back at the station, detectives reach out to their contacts in Brooklyn to see if anyone has heard of a tow truck driver nicknamed Nomi To.
No one has ever heard of this Nomi.
They searched and searched but couldn't find any records of Nomi. At this point, detectives are starting to believe he doesn't even exist.
Nobody knew Nomi because there was no Nomi.
Detectives now suspect Kashif has lied to them. But what is he trying to hide? Or rather, who? With their search for Nomi To a dead end for now, detectives shift their focus.
Kashif told detectives that he was in fact being unfaithful to Nazish and having an affair with a woman named Sarah Khan. So naturally, detectives realized they have to track Sarah Khan down.
Hi, yes, may I help you?
Yes, ma'am. Are you Sarah Khan?
Yes.
Sarah, do you know a man named Kashif?
Yes, he's my boyfriend.
According to Sarah, she'd met Kashif several years ago at a lecture in New York.
Sarah said when they met that he was separated from his wife and planning to get a divorce.
Sarah reveals to them that her and Kashif were together for 5 years. Kashif and Nazish were only married 6 years. So they realized the entire time Kashif and Nazish were married, he was also having an affair with Sarah.
It also means that he was lying to Sarah that whole time, living a double life with her while starting a family with his wife.
I'm sorry to tell you this, ma'am, but we have reason to believe that your boyfriend was involved in the murder of his wife.
Wait, his wife?
Yes, ma'am.
No.
During questioning, Sarah becomes upset, understandably so. She's learning that her boyfriend of 5 years is not only still married, he's not divorced, but that his wife was murdered.
Detectives continue to press Sarah, hoping to determine whether she knew anything about the plan to murder Nazish, or maybe even participated in it.
Was it possible Sarah wanted her out the picture so she could have them all to herself?
Look, listen, I've had enough. If you guys have any more questions, you guys can talk to my attorney.
She tells them she's done and asks them to leave.
If Sarah has nothing to hide, why won't she just answer their questions?
At this point, detectives are certain someone had to have helped Kashif with the murder. But as of now, they can't pinpoint who.
They decide to subpoena Kashif's phone records in hopes that he had communicated with his accomplice around the time of the murder.
And when those records come in, they reveal another surprising discovery.
They see a number that he is constantly texting, and that number is also texting him repeatedly.
The text messages right in the days before is clearly that they were plotting something.
One of those texts said, "You'll be free soon."
Detectives in Boonton, New Jersey have just discovered calls and text messages from Kashif Parvez's co-conspirator in the murder of his wife, Nazish Noorani.
They're quickly able to determine that the number doesn't belong to Sarah Khan.
Could it belong to the mysterious truck driver known only as Nomi To? That theory is quickly ruled out.
Based on the romantic content of many of the texts, it's clear the phone belonged to a woman, which means that Kashif had yet another mistress.
And in the days leading up to the murder, the messages turned from seductive to scheming.
The text messages right in the days before, it's clearly that they were plotting something.
One text is particularly chilling.
One of those texts said, "You'll be free soon."
But that's not all.
Right before the murders, detectives see a text message that said, "I'm parked right around the corner from Nazish's home."
They noticed that that same number was pinging off towers in New Jersey, right near the crime scene.
And after the murder, the phone traveled from Boonton across state lines and into Massachusetts, stopping at a town about 30 minutes from Boston, which is near where Kashif was studying at Harvard.
Detectives believe that whoever owns this phone is likely their shooter.
Then they're going to run that phone number, and they're going to see who it comes back to.
The number is registered to a 26-year-old woman named Antoinette Stephen.
She was a former student at Boston Architectural College.
Many of the pieces were coming together, because Kashif was also studying architecture.
At this point, detectives are convinced Antoinette was involved in the murder of Nazish Noorani. With a search warrant in hand, they head to Antoinette's home to speak with her.
Antoinette Stephen?
Yes? Mind if we ask you some questions?
Antoinette Stephen, when confronted by the police, agreed to speak with them.
She admits to knowing Kashif and confirms that they have a relationship, but she won't say much more than that.
Antoinette is not very forthcoming with information. She's pretty aloof, very neutral.
She denies having anything to do with the shooting that killed Nazish and injured Kashif.
But detectives aren't buying it.
Well, we have a warrant to search the premises.
What? Let me see that.
Please step aside.
And in Antoinette's bedroom closet, the investigators hit pay dirt.
They found in her closet, in a suitcase, 2 firearms that matched the shell casings in the scene.
Although they'll need ballistics testing to be sure, detectives are confident that these are the weapons used to kill Nazish and wound her husband.
Along with the phone records, the discovery of the guns gives detectives enough evidence to arrest Antoinette Stephen. That same day, Kashif is discharged from the hospital and arrested as well.
They were charged with murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and endangering the welfare of a child.
But even with 2 suspects now in custody, detectives still have a lot of questions.
Most importantly, detectives need to know which of the pair actually pulled the trigger.
As the case moves toward trial, investigators receive a promising call from Antoinette's attorneys.
Just homicide.
Once Antoinette realized that she was facing life without parole, she changed her tune. She was ready to talk.
She agrees to turn on Kashif and testify against him.
And as investigators sit down with Antoinette to hear her story, they're in for a wild ride.
They thought Kashif was a psychopath before, but they're blown away at what Antoinette has to say. They realized they had barely scratched the surface.
Two years after 26-year-old Nazish Noorani was shot and killed on the streets of Boonton, New Jersey, her husband Kashif Pervez and his secret mistress Antoinette Stephen are set to go to trial for the murder.
Investigators had uncovered text messages between the two plotting Nazisha's death, and they had found a murder weapon hidden in Antoinette's closet.
But in exchange for a lighter sentence, Antoinette decides to flip on her lover.
That would be the final nail in the coffin to put Kashif away as the mastermind for Nazisha's murder.
When Antoinette gives her updated statement, she doesn't hold back.
It all started back at architectural school.
They were classmates at that Boston Architectural College. That's how they met.
Antoinette explains that the relationship between her and Kashif was friendly at first, but eventually took a romantic turn.
She knew that he had a wife and children, but he said he was separated.
I wish we could spend every night like this.
Me too, honey. But it's not that simple.
According to Antoinette, Kashif told her separating from his wife would be easier said than done.
Within a Muslim marriage, it goes more than just going to the courthouse and getting a release of your legal responsibilities for one another.
But Antoinette says Kashif was desperate to get out of his marriage to Nazish.
Honestly, I don't know how much more I can take. You have no idea what she's really like.
He also told her a lot of negative things about Nazish, making her out to be a monster of a wife and a mother.
Kashif said that Nazish refused to get treatment for one of the sons who had sickle cell anemia, that she was neglecting and even abusing the children.
That's horrible. What kind of mother would do such a thing?
Right. I'm telling you, she's dangerous. I've been trying to get rid of her for years, but nothing's worked.
Antoinette says that's when Kashif made another shocking confession.
Years before the murder even occurred, he was contacting black magic companies to see if they could kill Nazish, trying to put a spell on her or have her poisoned.
He was going online to consult with voodoo practitioners and black magic practitioners to try to coerce Nazish into committing suicide.
He wasn't happy within the marriage in any way. He wanted to eliminate her well before he came up with the plot to eliminate her.
Listen, Antoinette. I need your help. If not for me, think of my son. She's killing him.
In Antoinette's mind, she believed Kashif. She wanted the boys to be safe from what she believed was Nazish's neglect and abuse.
So, I agreed to help him. He told me it was the only way.
She says she knew killing someone was wrong, but she genuinely thought she was doing it to help save the life of a sick child from his uncaring mother.
That night, I drove from Boston to Boonton. Then I waited.
However, when Kashif and Nazish emerged from her sister's home around 11 p.m., there was one problem.
The baby did not want to be left behind, and that threw Antoinette off. She wasn't expecting to see the baby, but she still carried out the plan.
Antoinette explains that she approached the young family and pointed the .38 pistol right at Nazish.
No, please, please, I have kids, please.
Do it! Do it! What are you waiting for?
Nazish's last heroic act demonstrated a mother's love. She threw her body in front of the stroller so that it did not roll down the hill and harm her son.
Then Antoinette switched to the smaller caliber gun to shoot Kashif in the leg and the arm.
I don't want to hurt you.
The cops are coming, come on!
Afterward, Antoinette fled, while Kashif called 911, pretending to be an innocent victim.
911, where's your emergency?
I just got shot in my leg. Send an ambulance.
The worst part is, I thought I was helping his son, but it turns out it was all a lie. His son was never even sick.
Neither of the children have sickle cell anemia, and Nazish never withheld any medical attention from them.
Kashif was a mastermind, a master manipulator. He was so good that he got a woman to kill for him.
And when Kashif Parvez's trial begins in May 2015, prosecutors are quick to expose even more of Kashif's lies.
Kashif's claims about being enrolled at Harvard and going to Columbia were also all lies.
I got in? Look.
Harvard?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Neither school had any record of Kashif ever being a student there.
To bolster their claim of Kashif being a liar and manipulator, prosecutors call an unexpected witness to the stand, his first mistress, Sarah Khan.
Sarah testifies to the many lies Kashif had told her over the years, but that's not all.
Turns out Kashif was actually violent towards Sarah in the past, just like he was with Nazish.
But the most damaging testimony against Kashif comes from his accomplice, Antoinette Stephen.
On the stand, Antoinette has some shocking claims. She was absolutely psychologically abused by Kashif.
Antoinette testifies to how Kashif manipulated her into helping him get rid of his wife.
Divorce is just frowned upon in the whole culture.
So he convinced Antoinette that the only way he could be free was to kill Nazish.
After only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury comes back with their verdict: guilty.
Kashif is sentenced to life in prison.
He won't be eligible for parole until 2077.
Antoinette pleaded guilty to the murder, and she got a 30-year sentence.
She's not eligible for parole until 2041. And then she will most likely be deported back to India.
Through their devastation, Nazish's family is happy that justice has been served.
They were relieved. They said justice has been done. They weren't joyous, but they said justice has been done. We're satisfied.
But even though Kashif won't be able to hurt anyone else, it doesn't diminish the horror of what he did to his loving wife.
To plot to murder someone just to be with somebody else, that's psychopath thinking, not normal behavior.
It's so tragic when you have a beautiful, talented, intelligent young woman, and the only thing wrong that she did was fall in love and start a family with a man who was a monster.
Abuse is never okay. If you or someone you love is in an abusive relationship, there is help available. Call the Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800.
There are moments when a missing person report still feels like a mystery, and there are moments when, almost immediately, something inside the story feels terribly wrong. On August 4, 2026, in the Orlando area of Orange County, Florida, a 71-year-old man named Jorge Vasquez Escartilla was reported missing. At first, the words were simple: he could not be found. But the details surrounding his disappearance were anything but simple. His phone was still at home. His wallet was still there. His keys had not gone with him. His vehicle remained at the house, and its door was reportedly unlocked, something his family considered unusual. Jorge had memory problems, making his sudden disappearance even more alarming. A man who might already be vulnerable because of declining memory had seemingly vanished without taking the ordinary things he would need to go anywhere. Then investigators noticed something else. There was what appeared to be a bloodstain on a fence outside the home. In a matter of hours, the meaning of the missing person report began to change. This was no longer only a search for an elderly man who might have wandered away. Investigators now had to consider the possibility that something had happened inside, or around, the place where Jorge was last known to be. And then, just before midnight, the case took a turn so disturbing that the original question, "Where is Jorge?" was replaced by another one. What had happened to him? 3 suitcases were discovered near the area where Jorge lived. They did not contain clothing, personal belongings, or the ordinary clutter of luggage abandoned by someone in a hurry. According to investigative records described by news organizations, they contained human remains. One suitcase contained Jorge's head, while other remains were found in the others. The discovery transformed the investigation. A missing 71-year-old man had become the victim of an apparent homicide, and the suitcases suggested that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal what had happened to him. But the story was not beginning at the suitcases. It was beginning with a man. Jorge Vasquez Escartilla was 71 years old. Neighbors remembered him as kind and helpful, someone who was willing to lend a hand when people around him needed assistance. One neighbor recalled Jorge helping with yard work and offering support when it was needed. Those details may sound ordinary, but in a case like this, ordinary details become deeply important. They remind us that before investigators saw evidence, before newspapers described suitcases, and before a criminal charge entered the story, Jorge was simply a person living his life. He had routines. He had relationships. He had people who knew when something about him was not right. And on August 4th, those people realized that he was missing. The fact that his belongings remained behind made the disappearance harder to explain. If Jorge had decided to leave voluntarily, why were the things he normally carried with him still there? If he had gone somewhere unexpectedly, why had his vehicle remained at home? If he had become confused because of his memory problems, where had he gone, and why was there an apparent bloodstain on the fence? Questions multiplied faster than answers. Then came the cameras. Investigators obtained surveillance footage that, according to the police affidavit as reported by media outlets, showed a man wearing black clothing and a blue waist bag entering an area behind the home. Later, that person appeared with large suitcases. Investigators said the video showed conduct they believed was consistent with placing human remains into the luggage. The person was then seen pulling the heavy suitcases away from the property. That footage became one of the most unsettling pieces of the case because it appeared to connect the quiet disappearance of Jorge with the physical movement of the suitcases. But investigators still needed to establish who the person was. Their attention turned to Jose L. Proano, 44 years old, Jorge's stepson. Proano was not a stranger who happened to pass through the neighborhood. He was part of the family structure surrounding the home. And according to information described in investigative records, his relationship with Jorge had been difficult. Proano reportedly told investigators that he had a negative relationship with Jorge and believed Jorge had interfered with his ability to have contact with his mother. That detail introduced a possible source of tension between the two men. It did not, by itself, prove a motive for murder. But as investigators reconstructed the timeline, the family relationship became impossible to ignore. Then there was the phone data. According to the case information reported by news organizations, Proano's phone placed him near the home around the period when surveillance footage showed a person moving the remains. Later, the phone data also placed him along the route where the suitcases were discovered. Investigators believed those digital records conflicted with Proano's reported denial that he was the person shown in the surveillance footage. One piece of evidence rarely tells an entire story. But investigators were no longer looking at one isolated clue. They had a missing man. They had his belongings left behind. They had an apparent bloodstain. They had surveillance footage. They had 3 suitcases containing human remains. They had phone location evidence. And they had a family relationship marked, according to the investigation, by conflict. There was another layer to the story as well. Records reportedly showed that Proano had previously made multiple 911 calls asking officers to check on his mother. He had expressed fears that something bad might be happening to family members, and officers had responded to some of those calls and found the situation safe. Investigators also reported that Proano told them he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had heard voices that made him concerned about the safety of people close to him. That information requires caution. A mental health diagnosis does not explain a homicide, and it does not establish guilt. It does not tell us what a person intended, what he understood, or what state he was in at a particular moment. Those questions require evidence, medical evaluation, and the legal process. In a true crime story, it is important not to turn a diagnosis into a convenient explanation for violence. There were also statements from people who knew Proano. According to reports based on the investigative affidavit, some individuals told investigators that Proano had made statements about killing Jorge, or about having dealt with Jorge and striking him. Another person was reportedly contacted by Proano and asked for help connected to the situation. Individually, each detail could be questioned. Together, investigators believed they formed a pattern. On August 5, Jose L. Proano was arrested and accused of first-degree murder in connection with Jorge Vázquez Escartia's death. But an arrest is not a conviction. A charge is not a verdict. And at the moment this story begins, the courtroom has not yet delivered its final answer. What remains is the question that hangs over every detail: what happened inside that home before the suitcases appeared? Was the violence planned? Was it sudden? What exactly happened between Jorge and Jose? When did Jorge die? What happened during the hours between his disappearance and the discovery of the remains? And why were 3 suitcases used to move and conceal the body? Those questions matter because the most shocking evidence in this case tells us what was discovered, but not necessarily everything that happened before it. The 3 suitcases are the image that may remain in the public memory. They are easy to picture, impossible to forget, and horrifying precisely because ordinary objects were transformed into containers for the remains of a human being. But Jorge should not be remembered only through those suitcases. He was 71 years old. His neighbors remembered kindness. He helped people around him. He was a man whose absence was noticed because people knew his presence. His memory problems made his disappearance especially concerning, but they do not define his life. For the people who knew him, the hardest part was not learning that Jorge had died. It was the realization that the safety of home had been shattered. The place where life unfolded had become the center of a murder investigation, and every object could carry a question about the last hours of his life. And that is where this story begins. Not with a suitcase. Not with an arrest. Not even with a crime scene. It begins with a family realizing that Jorge was gone, with belongings left behind exactly where they should have been, and with a silence that suddenly felt wrong. Within hours, that silence would be broken by the discovery of 3 suitcases. And behind them was a story that investigators would have to reconstruct piece by piece, trying to understand how a 71-year-old man disappeared from his own life, how his remains came to be hidden so close to home, and what happened in the final hours before Jorge Vázquez Escartia was never seen alive again. Part 2. The setting. Orlando is a city that can make almost any story look ordinary from the outside. In the bright Florida heat, palm trees line roads, traffic moves past shopping centers and quiet residential streets, and houses sit behind driveways, fences, lawns, and parked cars as if each one were sealed inside its own small world. It is a place where tourists arrive looking for sunshine and escape, where people build routines around work, family, errands, and the simple repetition of everyday life. But behind the walls of those ordinary homes, private lives can be complicated, and sometimes the most disturbing events happen in places that look completely unremarkable from the street. That was the environment surrounding Jorge Vázquez Escartia. In the summer of 2026, the Orlando area was moving through another season of intense Florida heat. The kind of heat that settles over everything. The air can feel heavy even before midday, and by afternoon the pavement radiates warmth back into the streets. Lawns require constant attention. Trees and vegetation grow quickly. Storms can appear suddenly, dark clouds gathering over neighborhoods before rain sweeps through and disappears almost as quickly as it arrived. In such an environment, people become accustomed to movement. Cars coming and going. Neighbors walking outside. Deliveries arriving at doors. Someone working in a yard. Someone opening a gate. Someone dragging a suitcase toward a vehicle. Nothing about those actions is necessarily suspicious. And that is part of what makes the events surrounding Jorge so disturbing. The home where he lived was not a remote cabin in the wilderness. It was not an isolated structure surrounded by miles of empty land. It existed within a community where other people lived close enough to notice changes, where cameras could record movement, and where a missing person could quickly become the subject of a search. Yet whatever happened to Jorge initially remained hidden. The people around him knew him through small, familiar details. A face appearing in the neighborhood. A greeting. A conversation. Help with something in the yard. The ordinary gestures that slowly create a person's presence within a community. Neighbors later described Jorge as kind and helpful. Those descriptions may seem insignificant compared with the brutality investigators eventually uncovered, but they are important because they establish the contrast between the man and the way his final days would be remembered publicly. Jorge was not known because he was famous. He was not known because he held a powerful position. He was known because he was there. And when he suddenly wasn't, someone noticed. That is often the first invisible line between an ordinary disappearance and a case that becomes something much darker. Jorge was 71 years old, and he was experiencing memory problems. For a family, that kind of vulnerability changes the meaning of a person's absence. If an elderly person disappears, there are many possibilities to consider. Perhaps he became confused. Perhaps he went somewhere unexpectedly. Perhaps he forgot where he was going. Perhaps he had an accident. Perhaps he was taken somewhere for medical attention. Every possibility carries fear. The first hours are therefore crucial. Family members do not immediately know whether they are dealing with a misunderstanding or an emergency. They begin checking the places they expect to find the missing person. They call relatives. They search rooms. They look outside. They check the driveway. And then they notice the things that do not make sense. Jorge's phone was still at home. His wallet was still there. His keys were still there. His vehicle remained at the property. The vehicle's door was reportedly unlocked. Each detail was small, but together they formed a picture that was difficult to reconcile with a normal departure. If Jorge had simply decided to go somewhere, why would he leave his phone behind? Why would he leave his wallet? Why would he leave his keys? Why would his car remain at home? And because of his memory problems, the possibility that he had simply wandered away carried its own danger. If he had left on foot, someone needed to find him quickly. If he had become disoriented, every passing hour mattered. The family reported him missing on August 4, 2026. At that moment, there was still no public story of murder. There were no suitcases. There was no accused killer. There was only a missing 71-year-old man and a family desperate to understand where he had gone. The first response to a disappearance is often built around uncertainty. Investigators must resist the temptation to assume what happened. They gather facts. They establish timelines. They ask who last saw the missing person. They examine the home. They look at vehicles. They review surveillance footage. They try to determine whether the person left voluntarily or whether something forced them to leave. In Jorge's case, the home itself began to raise questions. Investigators reportedly discovered what appeared to be a bloodstain on a fence outside the residence. A single stain does not automatically reveal a crime. It can have many explanations. But in the context of a missing elderly man whose belongings were still inside the house, it demanded attention. The atmosphere of the investigation changed. A missing person search was beginning to resemble a crime scene examination. And then there was the family relationship. Jose L. Proano was 44 years old. He was Jorge's stepson, the son of Jorge's wife. That meant the people connected to the disappearance were not necessarily strangers passing through the neighborhood. They were connected through family. Family homes often contain layers of history that are invisible to outsiders. Old arguments, financial frustrations, personal boundaries, resentments that appear and disappear. People who live under the same roof can know each other's routines intimately while still carrying feelings they rarely express openly. According to investigative information later reported by news organizations, Proano described his relationship with Jorge as negative. One issue reportedly involved Proano's belief that Jorge had restricted his access to his mother. That does not establish a motive for murder. It is only one piece of the background investigators were examining. But when someone disappears inside a family environment, relationships become part of the map. Who was close to Jorge? Who had access to the home? Who knew his routine? Who knew when he was alone? Who might have noticed if he suddenly disappeared? And perhaps most importantly, who could explain why his personal belongings remained behind? Investigators also learned about Proano's previous interactions with law enforcement. According to reports based on investigative records, he had made multiple 911 calls asking officers to check on his mother. He had expressed fears that something bad might be happening to family members. Police had responded to some of those calls and found no immediate danger. Later, Proano reportedly told investigators that he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had heard voices that caused him to fear for the safety of people around him. Those details form part of the background, but they should not be mistaken for an explanation. A mental health condition is not a confession. It is not proof of violence. And it is not evidence that someone is incapable of distinguishing reality from imagination at a particular moment. Those questions require professional assessment and legal scrutiny. The investigators had to focus on evidence. And the evidence was beginning to accumulate. One of the most important sources was surveillance. Modern neighborhoods are filled with cameras. Doorbell cameras. Security systems. Cameras overlooking driveways and entrances. Cameras belonging to businesses. Cameras that record continuously without anyone paying attention to them until something happens. A camera can preserve a moment that nobody realized was important. In this case, investigators reviewed footage that reportedly showed a man dressed in black, wearing a blue waist bag, entering an area behind the residence. Then the man appeared with large suitcases. The footage would later become central to the investigation because of what the investigators believed it showed. The person was seen moving the luggage away from the home. According to the police account reported by media organizations, the footage also captured behavior investigators interpreted as placing human remains inside the suitcases. The image is difficult to reconcile with the quiet surroundings of an ordinary neighborhood. A person walking. A suitcase rolling behind them. Another suitcase. Then another. To an observer who did not know what was happening, it might have looked like someone moving belongings. But investigators were beginning to see something else. They were beginning to see the movement of a body. And then the investigation followed another modern trail, the trail created by a mobile phone. According to the case information reported by news organizations, data associated with Proano's phone placed it near the residence during the period when the surveillance footage showed the person moving the suitcases. Later, the phone data reportedly placed him along the route where the suitcases were found. Digital evidence can be powerful because it creates a timeline. A person may deny being somewhere. A witness may remember incorrectly. A camera may not clearly show a face. But a phone can leave a trail of locations that investigators can compare against other evidence. In this case, the phone data became another piece of the developing picture. Still, at this stage, investigators did not yet have the full story. They had fragments. A missing man. A house. An unlocked vehicle. Personal belongings left behind. A suspicious mark on a fence. A complicated family relationship. Surveillance footage. A phone moving through the area. And somewhere nearby, 3 suitcases that had not yet been publicly connected to Jorge. Then, just before midnight on August 4th, investigators discovered the suitcases. What they found inside would eliminate one possibility almost completely. Jorge had not simply wandered away. He had not accidentally become lost somewhere in Orlando. He had not left his old life behind without explanation. His remains had been hidden in luggage. The quiet Florida neighborhood had become the center of a homicide investigation. And the investigators now faced a far more difficult task than simply finding a missing man. They had to reconstruct the final hours of his life. They had to determine where the violence occurred. They had to establish who had access to him. They had to understand why his body had been separated and moved. They had to determine who handled the suitcases. And they had to answer the most important question of all. Why Jorge? The setting had been ordinary. That was precisely what made the case so unsettling. There had been no warning sirens in the streets, no obvious sign to the outside world that a tragedy was unfolding behind a familiar fence. Life around the neighborhood continued. Cars passed. People went about their routines. The Florida heat remained oppressive. The streets looked much as they always had. But somewhere within that ordinary landscape, Jorge's life had ended. And by the time the 3 suitcases were discovered, investigators were no longer searching for a missing neighbor. They were searching through the remains of a life that had been deliberately hidden. Part 3, The Victim's Story. Jorge Vasquez Escartilla, the man people remembered as kind. There is a strange transformation that happens in a murder investigation. A person who was once known by a name becomes a case number. A photograph becomes evidence. A house becomes a crime scene. And a human life, with all its ordinary routines and quiet moments, can suddenly be reduced to a few cold words in a police report. Missing. Deceased. Homicide victim. But before Jorge Vasquez Escartilla became any of those things, he was simply Jorge. He was 71 years old. He lived in the Orlando area of Orange County, Florida, surrounded by the familiar rhythms of a neighborhood where people came and went, cars pulled into driveways, doors opened and closed, and ordinary conversations happened across fences and front yards. To the outside world, there was nothing particularly dramatic about his life. And perhaps that is precisely what makes the story so painful. Because Jorge was not remembered by the people around him as a dangerous man, a wealthy man, a powerful man, or someone who constantly attracted attention. He was remembered as something much simpler. A good neighbor. A kind man. Someone willing to help. One neighbor recalled that Jorge had helped with work around the yard and had been the sort of person people could turn to when they needed assistance. Those details may sound small. They are. But small details are often where a person's real life exists. Not in newspaper headlines. Not in police statements. Not in courtroom arguments. But in the ordinary moments that nobody thinks will ever become important. A helping hand with something in the yard. A conversation over a fence. A familiar face appearing in the neighborhood. A person who had become part of the landscape of everyday life. And then there was something else about Jorge that made his sudden disappearance especially frightening. He was experiencing memory problems. That meant his family already carried a particular kind of worry. When an older person with memory difficulties does not come home, there is always the possibility of confusion. Perhaps they have taken a wrong turn. Perhaps they forgot where they were going. Perhaps they became disoriented. Perhaps they simply needed help finding their way back. Families who live with that uncertainty understand how quickly an ordinary absence can become an emergency. Every passing minute matters. Every unanswered phone call becomes heavier. Every possibility seems worse than the one before it. So when Jorge could not be found on August 4, 2026, his disappearance was not treated as a casual absence. His family became concerned. And they had reasons to believe something was wrong. His phone was still at home. His wallet was still there. His keys were still there. His vehicle had not gone anywhere. And there was another detail that stood out. The vehicle was left unlocked. For a man whose family was already worried about his memory, those details could have suggested many things. But they also suggested something more disturbing. Jorge had not simply packed a few things and decided to leave. There was no obvious preparation. No phone. No wallet. No keys. No vehicle. It was as if the normal chain of a person's daily life had suddenly been interrupted. One moment, Jorge was there. Then he wasn't. And the things that should have traveled with him remained behind. That is the kind of disappearance that leaves a family staring at an empty space and asking the same question again and again. Where did he go? The last ordinary moments. We often imagine the final moments of a murder victim as if they must have been dramatic. A confrontation. An argument. A warning. A sudden decision. But real life rarely announces its endings. There is usually no soundtrack. No warning. No moment when the victim understands that this is the last ordinary minute of their life. For Jorge, the beginning of August may have looked like any other period in his life. The Florida heat continued outside. The neighborhood carried on. People moved through their routines without knowing that something terrible was about to happen, or had perhaps already happened. And somewhere inside that familiar environment, Jorge's life was moving toward its final chapter. We do not have every detail of his last hours. That distinction matters. There are still unanswered questions about exactly when Jorge died, exactly what happened inside the residence, and precisely how the events unfolded. Those gaps should not be filled with imagination and presented as fact. But there are things investigators did find. A stain resembling blood was discovered on a fence outside the home. His personal belongings remained behind. And eventually, 3 suitcases would be found nearby. Inside them were human remains. The remains of Jorge. Those discoveries would later force investigators to reconstruct what happened from fragments. But before the evidence could speak, there was a family looking for an elderly man they loved. A family that did not yet know that their missing person report was about to become a homicide investigation. The fear of not knowing. For families, the first stage of a disappearance can be uniquely cruel. There is no body. No confirmation. No certainty. Only possibilities. And possibilities can become unbearable. If Jorge had simply wandered away because of his memory problems, there were questions about where he might have gone. Was he confused? Was he somewhere nearby? Had he become unable to find his way home? Was he injured? Did he need medical assistance? Each possibility carried fear. But there was still hope. Because when someone is missing, the mind instinctively reaches for the least terrible explanation. Maybe he would walk back through the door. Maybe someone would find him. Maybe the next phone call would bring good news. Then investigators began examining the circumstances surrounding his disappearance. And those circumstances did not look normal. A man with memory problems was gone. His phone was still at home. His wallet was still there. His keys were still there. His vehicle remained at the residence. The car was unlocked. And outside, investigators found what appeared to be a bloodstain on a fence. One clue alone might have had an innocent explanation. Together, they formed a different picture. The investigation was no longer simply asking, "Where is Jorge?" It was beginning to ask, "What happened to Jorge?" That distinction would become critical. A life that did not end with the headlines. When a murder is reported, the public often learns about the victim only through the circumstances of death. Age. Location. Date. Cause of death. Perhaps a photograph. Perhaps the name of an accused person. But that can create an uncomfortable illusion. It can make the victim seem as though they existed only in relation to the crime. Jorge was 71. But 71 years cannot be summarized by a police report. There were decades before the final day. There were relationships. There were memories. There were people who knew him in ways investigators could never completely reconstruct. There were probably routines that seemed insignificant at the time but mattered because they were his. The way he moved through his neighborhood. The people he greeted. The things he helped others with. The familiar presence of a man who had been there long enough to become recognizable to those around him. And that is why the description from neighbors matters. They did not describe a monster. They described someone kind. Someone helpful. Someone who had done ordinary good things for other people. That does not solve a homicide. It does not identify a killer. It does not explain what happened. But it tells us something important about the person at the center of the investigation. Jorge was not merely the object of an investigation. He was someone's neighbor. Someone's family member. Someone whose absence was immediately noticed. And someone whose life had value long before the police ever arrived. The family's worry. There is another layer to this story that cannot be ignored. Jorge's memory problems meant that his family may already have understood the vulnerability that came with his age. Memory loss can alter the way families experience ordinary life. A trip to the store can become a question. A missed phone call can become a concern. A change in routine can become something worth checking. And when an older person disappears, the family may have to confront several fears simultaneously. The fear that the person is confused. The fear that they are hurt. The fear that they may be somewhere alone. And, eventually, the fear that someone may have harmed them. On August 4th, those fears became reality. But at first, the family did not know that. All they knew was that Jorge was missing. The objects he normally might have taken with him were still at home. The vehicle had not been driven away. And there was no clear explanation for where he had gone. The family had to wait for answers from people who were themselves still searching for them. That is one of the most difficult aspects of any disappearance. The people who love the missing person are forced to live inside uncertainty while investigators try to turn uncertainty into evidence. The neighborhood after Jorge disappeared. Imagine the neighborhood during those hours. The same streets. The same homes. The same fences. The same Florida night approaching. But something had changed. Jorge was not there. Perhaps neighbors looked toward the house and wondered what had happened. Perhaps people who had known him began talking about the last time they had seen him. Perhaps someone remembered a conversation that had seemed completely ordinary. A small interaction that had never seemed important before. This is another cruel feature of a disappearance. Afterward, ordinary memories become evidence. People replay conversations. They reconstruct movements. They ask themselves questions. When did I last see him? What was he wearing? Did he seem different? Did he say anything unusual? Did I notice a vehicle? Did I hear something? The human mind searches backward, trying to find the moment when the future changed. But the people around Jorge could not know that the answer might already be sitting somewhere near them. 3 suitcases. The man in the back of the house. Investigators would eventually turn their attention toward security footage. The footage became one of the most important elements in the case. A man appeared wearing black clothing. He had a blue-colored waist bag. He moved into the area behind the residence. And then came the suitcases. Large suitcases. The kind that immediately attract attention when they are being moved in an unusual context. According to the investigative account, the footage showed the man with the luggage and behavior investigators interpreted as placing human remains into one of the suitcases. Then the man was seen pulling the heavy luggage away from the residence. That footage would later become one of the central pieces of the investigation. But even before investigators knew exactly who the man was, the image carried a disturbing implication. Someone had been moving something heavy away from the property. And somewhere nearby, an elderly man was missing. The pieces were beginning to move toward one another. The person behind the name. The person investigators eventually focused on was Jose El Proano. He was 44 years old. And he was not a stranger to Jorge. He was the son of Jorge's wife. That relationship transformed the case. Because now investigators were not simply looking for a random offender who had entered a neighborhood. They were looking inside a family connection. According to investigative documents reported by the media, Proano described his relationship with Jorge as negative. One issue reportedly involved Proano's belief that Jorge had limited his ability to spend time with his mother. Whether that resentment was a genuine motive, part of a larger conflict, or merely one piece of a much more complicated relationship remained a question for investigators and, ultimately, the court. But the relationship was significant. Jorge and Proano had history. They were connected through family. And that meant investigators had to look not only at what happened on August 4th, but at what may have been building before it. A troubling history of calls. There was another element in Proano's history that investigators examined. Emergency calls. According to records cited in media reports, Proano had previously contacted 911 multiple times asking police to check on his mother. He believed something bad might be happening to family members. Officers responded. They checked. And on those occasions, the situation was reportedly found to be okay. Those earlier calls became relevant because they provided investigators with a glimpse into the complicated relationship between Proano, his mother, Jorge, and the police. Proano also reportedly told investigators that he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had heard voices that made him fear for the safety of relatives. That information must be handled carefully. A diagnosis is not a motive. Hearing voices is not proof that someone will become violent. Mental illness does not automatically explain a homicide. And it would be deeply irresponsible to suggest otherwise. The important question is not simply what diagnosis a person has. The important questions are what the evidence shows about their actions, their intent, their state of mind at the relevant time, and how those issues are evaluated by qualified professionals and the court. In Jorge's case, those questions would remain part of the larger legal and investigative picture. When a person becomes a memory. By the time investigators began piecing together the case, Jorge's life was already being reconstructed through the memories of other people. The neighbor who remembered his kindness. The family who knew about his memory problems. The people who knew his routines. The people who knew Proano. The investigators examining the house. The analysts reviewing phone records. And eventually, the forensic specialists examining what had been recovered from 3 suitcases. Every one of them held a fragment. None held the whole story. That is what homicide investigations often become. A search for a complete story using incomplete memories. A stain. A camera. A phone signal. A suitcase. A statement. A relationship. A missing man. One piece does not necessarily prove everything. But when pieces begin fitting together, investigators start seeing a pattern. And in this case, the pattern was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The last image of Jorge. There is something profoundly unsettling about a person becoming missing before anyone understands that they have died. For a period of time, Jorge existed in that terrible space between presence and absence. His family could still imagine him alive. Investigators could still search for him. Neighbors could still hope someone would find him. But somewhere in the investigation, the evidence began telling a darker story. The phone remained. The wallet remained. The keys remained. The car remained. The blood-like mark remained on the fence. And then the suitcases were discovered. 3 of them. Not clothing. Not belongings. Human remains. Jorge's remains. At that point, the question changed forever. There was no longer a missing 71-year-old man whom authorities hoped to bring home safely. There was a 71-year-old man whose final moments had become the subject of a homicide investigation. And the people who remembered him as a kind neighbor were now forced to remember something else. They would never see Jorge walking through the neighborhood again. The person before the crime. It is easy, when telling a case like this, to let the most horrifying details dominate the narrative. 3 suitcases. A body. A fence. A camera. A suspect. But Jorge's story deserves to begin somewhere else. It begins with a man who helped people. A man whose neighbors remembered kindness. A man who was 71 years old and dealing with memory problems. A man whose family knew that his disappearance could be dangerous. A man whose belongings were left behind as if his life had been interrupted in the middle of an ordinary day. And perhaps that is the most important thing to remember before we move deeper into this case. Jorge was not born a homicide victim. He did not live his life waiting for his final headline. He had 71 years of existence before August 4, 2026. The crime occupies only a tiny fraction of that lifetime. But for the people left behind, that tiny fraction changed everything. And now investigators had to reconstruct those final hours. What happened inside the house? What happened between Jorge and Jose Proano? When did the confrontation begin? When did Jorge's life end? And why were 3 suitcases needed afterward? The answers would not come from one clue. They would emerge slowly from surveillance footage, phone data, physical evidence, statements from people who knew the accused, and the disturbing discovery made just before midnight. The next chapter would move from the life of Jorge to the moment that life was violently interrupted. And this time, the story would no longer be about a man who had disappeared. It would be about what investigators believe happened to him. Part 4: The Incident. The night everything changed. There are moments in a criminal investigation when the story seems to divide itself into 2 halves. Before and after. Before, there is an ordinary house. Ordinary rooms. Ordinary objects. A phone resting where it was left. A wallet. A set of keys. A vehicle outside. A man named Jorge Vasquez Escartilla, 71 years old, living a life that, at least from the outside, appeared quiet and familiar. And then there is the after. A blood-like stain on a fence. 3 suitcases. Human remains. A neighborhood trying to understand what had happened. And a family forced to confront the possibility that the elderly man they had reported missing was never coming home. The precise sequence of Jorge's final moments remains an important question in the investigation. Not every detail has been publicly established. Not every minute has been accounted for. And that distinction matters. A responsible account cannot turn assumptions into facts. But investigators have described a chain of evidence that allows us to understand the broad outline of what they believe happened. At the center of that chain was the relationship between Jorge and Jose El Proano. A family connection. A strained relationship. A house. And, eventually, a series of movements captured by surveillance cameras. The events of August 4, 2026, would transform all of those ordinary elements into evidence. August 4. The date began like any other day on a calendar. August 4. Another hot Florida day. The kind of day when the air can feel heavy, when pavement holds the heat, and when even the quietest neighborhood seems to exist under the constant hum of summer. Nothing about the date itself suggested that it would later become attached to a homicide investigation. But somewhere during that day, Jorge disappeared. The exact moment when he was last seen alive has not been fully established in the publicly available information. That uncertainty is important. Because investigators were not simply trying to determine where Jorge went. They were trying to establish a timeline. A timeline can turn scattered evidence into a sequence. A camera timestamp can tell investigators when a person entered an area. A phone record can show where a device was located. A vehicle can establish movement. A physical stain can indicate that something happened at a particular place. And a witness statement can fill in a piece that technology cannot. The challenge was to determine how those pieces fit together. At some point, Jorge was inside or around the residence. At some point, he was no longer there. And investigators later came to believe that his death occurred in connection with the residence. But what happened between those points? That was the question. The house. A home is usually a place associated with safety. The front door closes. The lights come on. Family members know where everything is. The people inside understand the routines. The outside world stays outside. That sense of security makes violent crime inside a residence particularly disturbing. Because the walls that are supposed to separate a family from danger can also become silent witnesses. A hallway can hold the echo of an argument. A floor can preserve a trace of blood. A camera can record someone moving through an area. A piece of furniture can remain exactly where it was while a life changes forever. In Jorge's case, investigators found evidence outside the house that heightened their concern. A mark resembling blood was discovered on a fence. It was not, by itself, the entire story. But investigators did not look at it in isolation. They were already dealing with a missing elderly man. His belongings were still inside. His vehicle remained. And the circumstances did not suggest an ordinary disappearance. The stain therefore became another piece of a growing puzzle. The family realizes something is wrong. When Jorge's family reported him missing on August 4th, they were not simply reporting an elderly man who had gone out for a while. They were reporting someone whose absence did not make sense. His phone was still there. His wallet was still there. His keys were still there. His vehicle was still there. And the vehicle was reportedly left unlocked. Imagine standing there and seeing those things. The phone. The wallet. The keys. All the objects that normally accompany a person when they leave. Except the person was gone. It creates a strange kind of silence. The objects almost seem to insist. He didn't leave normally. For a family already concerned about Jorge's memory, that realization must have been frightening. They could not simply assume that he had decided to go somewhere. There was no obvious preparation. No simple explanation. And the longer he remained missing, the more urgent the situation became. Police were called. A search began. And investigators started examining the home. That was when the case began moving away from the world of missing persons and toward something much darker. The first sign of violence. Outside the residence, investigators found what appeared to be blood on a fence. The significance of such a discovery depends on context. A blood-like mark does not automatically explain a homicide. But context was exactly what investigators had. A 71-year-old man was missing. His belongings were still at home. His vehicle remained there. And now there was a suspicious stain. Investigators had to consider the possibility that Jorge had been injured. If he had been injured, where? If blood was present, whose blood was it? How did it get there? When did it appear? Was it connected to Jorge? Or was it unrelated? These questions would have required forensic examination and comparison with the other evidence. But even before every laboratory answer was available, the discovery changed the atmosphere of the investigation. The possibility of foul play could no longer be dismissed. The camera. Then investigators found something that could tell them what human memory could not. A camera. Surveillance footage. A silent record of movement. The camera did not provide a voice. It did not explain motive. It did not tell investigators what someone was thinking. But it could show what happened in front of its lens. According to the investigative account, the footage showed a man wearing black clothing. He had a blue waist bag. He entered the area behind the residence. At first, the image might have looked ordinary. A person walking. A person moving through a familiar space. But then the suitcases appeared. Large pieces of luggage. The man's behavior became more significant. Investigators later interpreted the footage as showing him placing human remains into one of the suitcases. Then he began moving the luggage away. Pulling it. Dragging its weight. Taking it away from the property. The camera had captured something investigators could now connect to the missing person report. A man. A residence. Suitcases. And an elderly man who could not be found. The footage became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. The weight of the suitcases. There is something revealing about the way a person moves when carrying an ordinary suitcase compared with something unusually heavy. The body reacts. The shoulders shift. The arms pull differently. The pace changes. The wheels drag. The person may stop. Adjust their grip. Pull harder. Surveillance footage does not show emotion the way a human face can. But movement can reveal physical effort. Investigators reportedly observed the man pulling the suitcases away from the residence. The luggage was not being casually carried out for a trip. It was being removed from the area. And investigators believed the contents were human remains. The significance of that moment would become clearer only after the suitcases were found. At the time the footage was recorded, investigators did not yet have the complete picture. They had a person moving luggage. But somewhere nearby, 3 suitcases were about to become the center of a homicide investigation. The road. Later that night, investigators discovered the luggage near the area where Jorge lived. 3 suitcases. Not 1. 3. They were found along a nearby route. The discovery occurred before midnight on August 4th. And when investigators opened them, the nature of the case changed instantly. Human remains were inside. 1 suitcase contained Jorge's head. Other parts of his body were found in the remaining luggage. There is a point in an investigation when the language of uncertainty becomes impossible to maintain. Before the discovery, investigators could say, Jorge is missing. After the discovery, they had to say, Jorge is dead. And the nature of his death was no longer consistent with an accident or natural causes. Someone had killed him, investigators believed. Someone had then separated his remains. Someone had placed those remains into multiple suitcases. And someone had transported them away from the residence. The question was no longer whether a crime had occurred. The question was, who did it, and why? 3 suitcases. The number 3 would become one of the most disturbing details in the case. 3 suitcases. 3 containers connected to the removal of Jorge's remains. 3 separate objects that investigators could trace through the surrounding evidence. The suitcases were not merely evidence of death. They were evidence of what happened afterward. Because after a person dies, another set of decisions begins. What does the killer do next? Do they call for help? Do they leave? Do they attempt to conceal what happened? Do they move the body? Do they clean the scene? Do they try to destroy evidence? Investigators believed the use of the suitcases represented an effort to conceal and remove Jorge's remains. That meant the investigation had to look beyond the killing itself. The investigators had to reconstruct the aftermath. Who had access to the suitcases? Where did they come from? Who moved them? When were they moved? How far were they transported? And who was recorded doing it? The name on the luggage. One detail reportedly drew additional attention. According to information cited from investigative records, one of the suitcases had a name label associated with Pro Ono's mother. That did not, by itself, establish who had placed Jorge's remains inside the luggage. But in the context of the other evidence, it became significant. Investigators were already examining the relationship between Pro Bono and Jorge. They were examining surveillance footage. They were examining phone data. And now there was luggage with a family connection. Evidence in a homicide investigation rarely arrives in neat packages. Instead, investigators encounter fragments. One fragment may mean almost nothing. Another may raise a question. A third may make the first two suddenly important. That was what was happening here. The suitcases were no longer anonymous pieces of luggage. They were becoming part of a trail. The phone. Then there was the phone. Modern homicide investigations often contain a strange contradiction. A person can disappear, but their digital footprint may continue. Phones communicate with cellular networks. Applications record activity. Location data can sometimes place devices within particular areas. And when investigators have a suspect and a timeline, the digital information can become powerful. According to the investigative account, Pro Bono's phone was located in the area of the residence during the period when surveillance footage showed the person moving the suitcases. Then, later, the phone was associated with the route near where the suitcases were discovered. The significance was obvious. If the person on camera was Pro Bono, the phone data would support that conclusion. If Pro Bono claimed he was not the person in the footage, investigators could compare that statement with the digital trail. A phone cannot tell investigators exactly what a person was thinking. But it can sometimes tell them where the device associated with that person was. And in a case built around movement, that matters. The denial. According to the information reported from the investigative records, Pro Bono denied being the person shown in the surveillance footage. That created a direct conflict. On one side, surveillance footage. On the other, a denial. And between them, phone location evidence. The investigators now had to ask whether the person captured on camera could be identified reliably. Was the clothing consistent? Was the body type consistent? Was the timing consistent? Was the route consistent? Was Pro Bono's phone in the same area? Could someone else have been using the phone? Could another person have appeared in the footage? Every alternative had to be considered. A serious investigation does not begin with the conclusion and then collect only the evidence that supports it. It must test competing explanations. But as investigators continued, the pieces increasingly pointed toward Pro Bono. The family connection. The case also contained something that no camera or phone tower could fully explain. The relationship. Jorge was not a random stranger. He was married to Pro Bono's mother. That meant Pro Bono had a personal connection to the home. He was familiar with the people there. And according to investigative records, he had described his relationship with Jorge as negative. The reported dispute involved access to his mother. Pro Bono believed, according to the investigative account, that Jorge had restricted his ability to see her. Whether that resentment developed over days, months, or longer is not fully established by the public information. But investigators had to consider whether the family conflict provided a possible motive. The question became darker. Could resentment inside a family have escalated into violence? And if it had, was the killing planned? Or had something happened that spiraled out of control? The use of multiple suitcases would later raise questions about planning. But preparation after a killing does not necessarily prove that the killing itself was planned. That distinction would matter. A person can make decisions after an unexpected event. A person can attempt to conceal a crime after committing it. The evidence would have to establish what happened. The people who heard his words. Investigators did not rely solely on cameras and phones. They also spoke to people who knew Pro Bono. According to statements reported from the investigative records, some individuals told investigators that Proano had made statements suggesting that he had killed Jorge or that he had talked about taking care of Jorge and beating him. Another person was reportedly contacted by Proano and asked for help concerning the situation. These statements became another layer of evidence. But statements from witnesses also require careful examination. What exactly was said? When was it said? In what context? Did the witness hear the words directly? Were they interpreted correctly? Was the person who made the statement frightened, angry, confused, or attempting to boast? Investigators would have to determine how reliable each account was. Still, the statements were significant because they potentially connected Proano's own words to the physical evidence already recovered. The moment the case changed. By the end of August 4th, investigators were no longer dealing with an unexplained disappearance. The evidence had changed the entire case. Jorge was dead. His remains had been found. They had been separated and placed into 3 suitcases. The luggage had been discovered near the neighborhood. Surveillance footage showed a man moving the suitcases. Investigators believed the man was Proano. Phone data reportedly placed Proano's device near the residence and later near the area where the luggage was found. And people who knew Proano provided statements about things he had allegedly said concerning Jorge. Individually, each piece of evidence could be questioned. Together, investigators believed they formed a coherent chain. But there was still one enormous question. Why? The last hours of Jorge. The most painful part of any homicide investigation is often the timeline that can never be completely recovered. A person's final hours belong to them. After death, investigators attempt to reconstruct those hours from evidence. But there will always be moments that no camera captured. Conversations that no microphone recorded. Thoughts that disappeared with the victim. For Jorge, the exact sequence remains incomplete in the public record. We know that he disappeared. We know his belongings remained at home. We know investigators discovered a blood-like stain. We know surveillance footage became important. We know 3 suitcases were found containing his remains. And we know investigators connected Jose Proano to the scene and the subsequent movement of the luggage. But between those facts are unanswered spaces. Those spaces matter. Because within them may lie the explanation for what happened. Was there an argument? Was Jorge attacked without warning? Was there an escalating dispute? Was the violence sudden? Was there preparation? Did Proano arrive intending to confront Jorge? Or did the situation become violent unexpectedly? The public record available at this stage does not answer every one of those questions. And so the investigation must be told with a boundary between evidence and inference. We can follow the trail. We cannot invent what happened in the rooms that the cameras did not see. The night closes in. As darkness settled over Orlando, the case had become something very different from the missing person report that began the day. The police were no longer simply searching for a 71-year-old man. They were processing a homicide scene. They were documenting physical evidence. They were examining surveillance footage. They were tracing phone data. They were interviewing people. And they were looking at the relationship between a victim and a man who was connected to him through family. Meanwhile, 3 suitcases sat at the center of the investigation. Their contents had transformed suspicion into certainty that something horrific had occurred. The search for Jorge had ended. The search for his killer had begun. The man who was no longer missing. There is a moment in every missing person case when investigators must deliver the news families fear most. Jorge would not be coming home. The elderly man whose memory problems had made his disappearance so alarming had been found. But not alive. His family had been looking for a person. Investigators had found remains. And somewhere in between those 2 realities was the story they now had to reconstruct. For the people who loved Jorge, the discovery could never be just evidence. It was the destruction of a future. No more ordinary conversations. No more helping in the yard. No more familiar presence. No more chance to see him walk through the door. And for investigators, the work was only beginning. Because finding the body is not the same as proving who killed the victim. Finding a suspect is not the same as proving guilt. And identifying a possible motive is not the same as establishing it beyond a reasonable doubt. The next stage would require investigators to turn suspicion into a case. They would have to follow every digital trace, every camera angle, every statement, every relationship, every contradiction. And most importantly, they would have to determine whether the man at the center of their investigation, Jose El Proano, could be placed not merely near the crime, but at the heart of it. The answers would emerge from evidence that was already beginning to point in one direction. But before investigators could reach that conclusion, they would have to enter the most difficult part of the case. The investigation itself. Part 5 of the discovery. The scene speaks. By the time investigators began examining the evidence surrounding Jorge Vázquez Escartia's disappearance, the question was no longer whether something terrible had happened. Something had. The question was how much of that terrible event could be reconstructed. Because a crime scene does not speak in sentences. It speaks in fragments. A stain on a fence. A vehicle left behind. A phone sitting inside a house. A wallet that never traveled with its owner. A set of keys. A camera recording movement. 3 suitcases abandoned near a roadway. And inside those suitcases, the remains of a 71-year-old man. Every fragment had to be documented. Every object had to be considered. And every apparent coincidence had to be tested. The investigators were looking at a scene that appeared to contain the aftermath of violence, but the scene itself could not tell them everything. It could not tell them what Jorge had been thinking. It could not tell them what had been said between the people involved. It could not tell them whether the violence had been planned hours earlier or erupted suddenly. But it could preserve traces. And those traces could become a timeline. The empty space. The first evidence was not a body. It was an absence. Jorge was missing. That sounds simple. But in an investigation, absence can be remarkably powerful. A person disappears from their normal environment, yet the objects associated with their normal life remain exactly where they were. That was the situation investigators faced. Jorge's phone was still at the residence. His wallet was still there. His keys were still there. His vehicle was still there. The car had reportedly been left unlocked. None of these details, standing alone, proves a crime. People leave phones behind. Cars are sometimes left unlocked. Keys can be forgotten. Wallets can remain inside a house. But investigators were not looking at each fact independently. They were asking whether the combination made sense. If Jorge had voluntarily left, why had he left behind so many things he would ordinarily need? If he had become disoriented, where was he? If he had simply wandered away, why was there evidence outside the house resembling blood? And if he had been harmed, what had happened to him? The answers were beginning to emerge. But they would not come quickly. The fence. Outside the residence, investigators encountered a detail that changed the tone of the search. A stain resembling blood had been found on a fence. At first glance, it was simply a mark. A discoloration. Something that might have had an innocent explanation. But in the context of a missing 71-year-old man, investigators could not ignore it. The first task would be to establish what the substance actually was. Was it blood? Was it human blood? Could it be connected to Jorge? Was it fresh? How did it get there? And what did the location tell them? A forensic examination could potentially answer some of those questions. But the physical location itself was already important. The fence was outside the home. That meant investigators had to consider whether something violent had occurred near that point. Perhaps someone had been injured. Perhaps someone had been moved. Perhaps the stain was related to another event. The investigation could not assume the answer. It had to test it. That is one of the least dramatic but most important parts of forensic work. The investigator sees something disturbing. The investigator does not immediately declare what it means. Instead, they collect it, document it, photograph it, test it, compare it, and only then does the evidence begin to speak. The house as a timeline. Investigators examining a home are not simply looking for obvious signs of violence. They are looking for disruptions. Things that appear out of place. Objects moved from their normal positions. Signs of cleaning. Damage. Traces. Missing items. Unusual patterns. Anything that might tell them that an ordinary routine was interrupted. In Jorge's case, the most striking feature was perhaps not what had been removed. It was what had remained. His personal belongings were still there. His life had been interrupted, but the objects that represented that life were still inside the house. His phone. His wallet. His keys. His vehicle. They formed an almost silent outline of his absence. Imagine the scene from the perspective of someone who knew Jorge. You enter the house expecting to find him. Instead, you see the things he would normally carry. The phone that should be in his pocket. The wallet that should be with him. The keys that should be in his hand. The car that should have taken him somewhere. But Jorge is gone. That is when a disappearance begins to feel less like an absence and more like an interruption. Someone, or something, had broken the normal sequence of his life. The search expands. As the hours passed, investigators could not afford to look only inside the home. A person could have left. A person could have been transported. Evidence could have been discarded somewhere nearby. Vehicles could have been used. And surveillance cameras might have captured movement. The search therefore expanded outward. Roads. Side streets. Nearby properties. Areas around the residence. Places where someone might abandon luggage without immediately attracting attention. That search would eventually lead investigators to one of the most disturbing discoveries in the entire case. 3 suitcases. Before midnight. It was shortly before midnight on August 4th. The day that had begun with a missing person report was approaching its end. But investigators were still working. Somewhere near the area where Jorge lived, they discovered luggage that appeared to have been abandoned. 1 suitcase. Then another. And another. 3 in total. The sight of abandoned luggage might normally trigger curiosity. But the circumstances made the discovery immediately suspicious. The luggage was connected to the area surrounding a missing elderly man. Investigators opened it. And what they found would redefine the case. There were human remains inside. The search for Jorge had reached its most horrifying answer. He had not wandered away. He had not simply become lost. He had not voluntarily left the neighborhood. He was dead. And someone had apparently gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal what had happened to him. The first suitcase. One of the suitcases contained Jorge's head. The discovery transformed the investigation instantly. A missing person had become a homicide victim. But the horror did not end with the identification of the remains. Investigators discovered additional body parts in the other luggage. The remains had been separated. They had been placed into multiple containers. And the containers had been transported away from the residence. This was no longer simply a question of cause of death. Investigators now had to examine a sequence of actions that appeared to have occurred after Jorge died. The person responsible, whoever that person was, had apparently needed to move the remains. That meant there had been decisions. Movement. Time. Access to luggage. access to transportation, and an attempt, whether carefully planned or improvised, to remove the evidence from the home. Those actions would become crucial, because sometimes what a perpetrator does after a killing can reveal as much about the investigation as the killing itself. The 3 suitcases. 3 suitcases create 3 physical objects that investigators can examine independently. Every suitcase can contain evidence: fibers, hair, DNA, fingerprints, trace material, blood, other biological evidence. The interior can tell investigators what was inside. The exterior can tell them how it was handled. And the locations where the suitcases were abandoned can provide another layer. Where was each one found? How far apart were they? What route connects them? Could a person have transported them on foot? Was a vehicle involved? Were there cameras along the route? Did anyone see someone carrying them? The investigation could now move backward. Instead of asking only, "Where is Jorge?" investigators could ask, "Where did these suitcases come from?" And if they could answer that, perhaps they could determine who had placed the remains inside them. A family name. One detail reportedly made the luggage even more significant. One suitcase was said to bear a name label associated with Pro Ono's mother. Again, the label alone could not establish who had used the suitcase. People lend luggage. Families share possessions. A name can remain attached to an object long after the object has changed hands. But context matters. Investigators were already examining Jose Pro Ono. They knew he had a family connection to Jorge. They were examining surveillance footage. They were examining phone location data. They were interviewing people who knew Pro Ono. The luggage therefore became another thread connecting the physical scene to the suspect. The question was no longer simply, "Whose suitcase is this?" It became, "Who had access to it, who moved it, and how does that movement fit the timeline?" The camera that would not forget. People can forget. People can lie. People can misremember. Cameras do not have memory in the human sense, but they preserve recorded moments. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage from the area. The footage reportedly showed a man dressed in black. A blue waist bag was visible. He moved into the area behind the residence. And then the luggage appeared. The footage became particularly disturbing because investigators interpreted the movements as showing the man placing part of a body into a suitcase. Afterward, he pulled the luggage away. The importance of the footage went beyond identification. It established sequence. The man appeared at the residence. The suitcases appeared. The suitcases were moved. And later, suitcases containing Jorge's remains were found nearby. The footage provided investigators with something they desperately needed: a possible bridge between the residence and the disposal location. The camera and the clock. Surveillance footage is valuable partly because it carries time. A timestamp can turn an event into a point on a timeline. If investigators know when the person entered the property, they can compare that with phone records. If they know when the luggage was moved, they can compare that with witness accounts. If they know when the suspect's phone was nearby, they can compare that with the video. And if all those events happen within a narrow window, the number of possible explanations begins to shrink. According to the investigative account, Pro Ono's phone was in the area of the residence around the time the surveillance footage showed the man moving the suitcases. Later, the phone was associated with the area near where the luggage was discovered. This was important because investigators were no longer relying on appearance alone. They had a second source of information. A digital trail. The phone silent journey. Imagine a phone as a silent witness. It cannot speak. It cannot explain itself. But it can leave traces of where it has been. If a person travels from one location to another, their phone may travel with them. And if investigators can establish the approximate location of that device, they can compare it with physical evidence. In this case, the phone data reportedly placed Pro Bono's device near the residence. Then it was associated with the area where the suitcases were found. That pattern mattered. If the person on the surveillance footage was not Pro Bono, investigators needed an explanation for why his phone appeared to follow the same general path. Could someone else have had the phone? Could the phone's location have been imprecise? Could another person have been involved? These questions are essential because digital evidence is powerful but not magical. A phone's location does not necessarily prove that its owner was holding it every second. Investigators have to establish how precise the data is and what it can actually prove. But in combination with physical and video evidence, it can become much more compelling. Witnesses begin to talk. The investigation also moved into another realm. Human testimony. Investigators spoke with people who knew Pro Bono. According to statements reported from the investigative records, some individuals described conversations in which Pro Bono allegedly talked about Jorge. One person reportedly said Pro Bono had admitted killing Jorge or had discussed taking care of him and beating him. Another person was reportedly contacted by Pro Bono and asked for help connected to the situation. These accounts were important. But investigators still had to determine their reliability. Witnesses can misunderstand. People can exaggerate. Memory can change. A phrase can sound different depending on the circumstances in which it was spoken. Therefore, the investigators' task was to compare those statements against independent evidence. Did the camera footage support them? Did the phone data support them? Did the physical evidence support them? Did the timeline support them? The more independent pieces matched, the stronger the overall case could become. The relationship becomes evidence. There was another reason investigators focused on Pro Bono. The relationship between the two men. Jorge was Pro Bono's stepfather. Not simply someone who lived nearby. Not a stranger. A member of the family. According to investigative records, Pro Bono described the relationship negatively. He reportedly believed that Jorge had restricted his contact with his mother. That resentment offered investigators a possible motive. But motive is often misunderstood. A motive does not prove that someone committed a crime. A person can have reasons to dislike another person and never harm them. Likewise, a person can commit a crime without investigators ever discovering a clear motive. The job of the investigation was not to find a story that sounded plausible. It was to determine whether the evidence showed that Pro Bono committed the killing. Still, the family conflict gave investigators a possible explanation for why Jorge might have become the target. The earlier 911 calls. Investigators also considered Pro Bono's previous interactions with law enforcement. According to records reported by the media, Pro Bono had called 911 several times asking police to check on his mother. He reportedly believed that something bad might be happening to members of his family. Officers responded. They checked the situation. And the earlier incidents did not result in the kind of emergency Pro Bono feared. These calls became relevant because they showed that Pro Bono had previously expressed concern about his mother's safety. They also provided investigators with more context about his relationship with Jorge and his mother. But again, context is not proof. Earlier 911 calls do not establish that someone later committed murder. They simply form part of the background investigators considered when trying to understand the relationships surrounding the case. The mental health question. At some point, the investigation also touched on Pro Bono's reported mental health history. According to the investigative information cited by media outlets, Pro Bono told investigators that he had a diagnosis of schizophrenia and had heard voices. That information could easily become sensationalized. It should not. There is a profound difference between reporting a person's claimed diagnosis and using that diagnosis as an explanation for violence. The existence of a mental illness does not automatically create criminal intent. It does not establish guilt. And it does not tell us what a person was experiencing at the precise moment of an alleged offense. Those questions require professional evaluation and legal scrutiny. If mental state becomes relevant in court, qualified experts may examine issues such as the defendant's condition at the time of the alleged offense, their ability to understand their actions, and other legally defined questions. But at this stage, the diagnosis remained one part of the background, not an answer to the murder. The evidence still had to stand on its own. Building the timeline. By now, investigators had several separate lines of evidence. They began with Jorge's disappearance. Then came his belongings. Then the suspicious mark on the fence. Then the 3 suitcases. Then the remains. Then the surveillance footage. Then the phone data. Then witness statements. Then the relationship between Jorge and Proano. Each piece answered one question while creating another. The suitcase answered where Jorge's remains had been placed. But who placed them there? The camera showed someone moving them. But who was the person? The phone data placed Proano near the relevant locations. But was the phone actually in his possession? Witnesses described statements allegedly made by Proano. But were those statements reliable? The family relationship suggested possible resentment. But was resentment enough to explain murder? Investigators had to connect the dots without assuming that every dot automatically belonged to the same picture. The road from the house. One of the most important questions became the physical route. The residence. The area behind the house. The place where the suitcases were found. The path between them. If the same person appeared on camera moving the luggage and the suspect's phone followed a corresponding route, the geographical relationship would become significant. Investigators could ask, where could the suspect have traveled? How long would it take? Were there cameras along the way? Were there witnesses? Could a vehicle have been used? Were there other possible routes? The case was beginning to resemble a map. Not just a map of streets. A map of movement. And every movement had a potential timestamp. The weight of 3 pieces. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of the investigation was not any single piece of evidence. It was the way different types of evidence appeared to converge. Physical evidence. Digital evidence. Video evidence. Witness evidence. Relationship evidence. These are different forms of information. A camera sees. A phone records. A forensic examination analyzes. A witness remembers. A relationship provides context. When all 5 appear to point in the same direction, investigators gain a much stronger foundation than they would have from any one source alone. That appears to have been the situation investigators believed they were facing. And the name emerging from that convergence was Jose L. Proano. The investigation turns toward one man. At some point, the investigation stopped being a search for an unknown offender. It became a case focused on a specific person. Jose L. Proano. 44 years old. Connected to Jorge through Jorge's wife. A man investigators believed had a negative relationship with the victim. A man whose phone was reportedly in the relevant areas. A man whose identity investigators believed was connected to the person captured on camera. And a man about whom witnesses allegedly provided statements concerning Jorge. The case was no longer simply, who killed Jorge? It had become, can investigators prove that Jose Proano was responsible? That was a much higher standard. Suspicion could lead police toward a suspect. Evidence would have to carry the case forward. What the scene could not say. For all the evidence investigators had recovered, there were still things the scene could not tell them. It could not tell them Jorge's final thoughts. It could not tell them whether he recognized the person confronting him. It could not tell them whether he was frightened. It could not tell them whether he tried to defend himself. It could not tell them what words were spoken. And it could not tell them whether the killing was planned. Those answers belonged to the investigation. Perhaps some would come from forensic evidence. Perhaps some from witness statements. Perhaps some from the accused himself. And perhaps some would never be known. That is one of the most difficult realities of homicide cases. Evidence can reconstruct movement. It can establish time. It can connect objects. It can reveal blood, DNA, fingerprints, digital traces. But there are moments when the truth remains hidden behind the silence of the dead. The first night ends. As August 4th turned into August 5th, investigators had already made the most important discovery of the case. They had found Jorge. But they had found him in pieces. The search had ended in horror. And now the investigation had to move forward. The next step would be to determine whether the person appearing in the surveillance footage could be identified beyond reasonable doubt. Whether the digital trail could be connected to a specific individual. Whether witness accounts could withstand scrutiny. Whether the family conflict provided context, or merely coincidence. And whether all of those fragments could be assembled into a case strong enough to support an arrest. The evidence had begun to speak. But it was not yet telling the whole story. There was still one person standing at the center of the investigation. Jose L. Proano. And within hours, the police would make their move. On August 5th, the man investigators believed had been connected to Jorge's final hours would be arrested and accused of first-degree murder. But an arrest is not a conviction. A police theory is not a verdict. And the next stage would require investigators to prove that the disturbing story they had reconstructed from cameras, phones, witnesses, luggage, and blood-like evidence was more than a collection of coincidences. It had to become a case. And that case would soon enter its most difficult phase. Part 6, the investigation. The suspect, the search, and the questions. By the morning of August 5, 2026, the investigation surrounding Jorge Vázquez Escartia had reached a decisive stage. The missing person case was over. The search for a body was over. But the search for answers had only begun. Investigators now had a victim. They had a suspected crime scene. They had 3 suitcases containing human remains. They had surveillance footage. They had phone location information. They had witness statements. And they had a name. Jose L. Proano. 44 years old. A member of Jorge's extended family through Jorge's marriage. A man investigators believed was connected to the movements captured on surveillance footage. A man whose phone, according to the investigative account, appeared in locations that corresponded with the timeline. And a man whose relationship with Jorge had reportedly been strained. But investigators knew something crucial. A person can look suspicious without being guilty. A person can be connected to a victim without being responsible for their death. A phone can be near a crime scene without proving who was holding it. A witness can remember incorrectly. A camera can show movement without revealing intention. So the job now was to take suspicion apart and examine every piece. If Proano was responsible, investigators needed to establish it. If there was another explanation, they needed to find it. The case would have to survive scrutiny. The name that kept appearing. The investigation increasingly returned to Proano. His connection to Jorge made him relevant from the beginning. He was not an unknown person who had appeared randomly in the neighborhood. He was connected to Jorge's wife. He had a relationship with the family. And, according to investigators, that relationship had problems. Proano reportedly told investigators that he had a negative relationship with Jorge. One issue involved his belief that Jorge had restricted his access to his mother. That detail provided investigators with something they could examine as a potential source of resentment. But investigators could not simply say, they did not get along, therefore Proano killed him. That would be an assumption, not an investigation. The question was whether the relationship could be connected to the physical evidence. And increasingly, investigators believed it could. The surveillance image. The surveillance footage became one of the most important pieces of the investigation. Investigators had an image of a man wearing black clothing. A blue waist bag was visible. The man entered the area behind the house. Later, he was seen with large suitcases. And the footage reportedly showed behavior investigators interpreted as placing human remains inside the luggage. Then he pulled the suitcases away. The image was disturbing. But it was also useful, because it gave investigators something they could compare with other evidence. Who had access to the property? Who owned or used similar clothing? Who could be identified by body characteristics? Who was nearby at that exact time? Who had a reason to be there? Who was connected to the luggage? And whose phone was in the area? Every question narrowed the field. The phone records. The phone data reportedly became another major link. Investigators determined that Pro Bono's phone was in the area of the residence during the period associated with the surveillance footage. Later, the device was associated with the area where the suitcases were discovered. That pattern mattered. It created a digital trail running alongside the physical trail. The physical trail was house, suitcases, roadway. The digital trail appeared to be Pro Bono's phone, residence area, disposal area. When two independent trails appear to follow the same path, investigators pay attention. But again, the distinction between a phone and its owner is important. A phone's location does not automatically prove the person's physical presence at every moment. Investigators must establish the reliability and limitations of the data. Could someone else have carried the phone? Could the location be imprecise? Could another explanation account for the movement? Those questions matter especially when the stakes are a first-degree murder charge. The investigators needed more than a suspicious pattern. They needed a case that could withstand challenge. The man on the video. According to the investigative account, Pro Bono denied being the person shown in the surveillance footage. That denial created a direct conflict. Investigators had to compare the footage with what they knew about him. The clothing, the physical appearance, the timing, the location, the movements, the phone, the luggage, and the surrounding circumstances. If Pro Bono's phone was at the residence at the same time the person on camera was moving the suitcases, that was significant. If the phone later appeared near the disposal location, that added another layer. If witnesses independently described Pro Bono making statements about Jorge, that created another. And if investigators could establish a connection between Pro Bono and the luggage, the picture became even stronger. The investigation was therefore no longer dependent on identifying a face in a single video frame. It was becoming a multi-source reconstruction. The witnesses. People who knew Pro Bono were interviewed. Some of their statements reportedly raised serious concerns. According to investigative information cited by media reports, one person told investigators that Pro Bono had admitted killing Jorge or had spoken about taking care of Jorge and beating him. Another person was reportedly contacted by Pro Bono and asked for assistance concerning the situation. If accurately reported, such statements could be significant. But investigators still had to determine exactly what had been said and under what circumstances. An alleged confession does not become automatically reliable simply because it sounds incriminating. Investigators must examine the context. Was it a direct statement? Was it a joke? Was it a threat? Was it an admission? Was the witness certain? Did the witness tell anyone else immediately afterward? Did physical evidence support the account? These questions matter. And in a case like this, investigators had an unusual advantage. They already had independent physical and digital evidence against which witness accounts could be compared. The suitcase with a family connection. The luggage itself became increasingly important. 3 suitcases had been abandoned. Inside were Jorge's remains. And at least one suitcase reportedly bore a label associated with Pro Bono's mother. The connection was striking. But again, the label did not automatically prove ownership at the time of the crime. A suitcase can change hands. A label can remain attached. A family member can lend luggage. The investigation therefore had to ask a more precise question. How did this particular suitcase become connected to the crime? If investigators could establish who had access to it, when it was moved, and whether other evidence connected it to Proano, its evidentiary value would increase. The suitcase was no longer simply a container. It was a potential bridge between the victim, the suspect, and the disposal process. The relationship with Jorge. Investigators also had to understand what existed between Jorge and Proano before August 4th. According to the reported investigative account, Proano described their relationship as negative. He reportedly believed Jorge had interfered with his relationship with his mother. That kind of resentment can become important in an investigation. But it can also be misleading. Families argue. People become estranged. Old grievances can exist for years without violence. So investigators had to determine whether the conflict had recently intensified. Was there a triggering event? Had there been threats? Had there been previous confrontations? Had Proano spoken about Jorge before the disappearance? Had anyone noticed tension? Those questions could help establish whether the relationship was merely unpleasant or whether it had escalated into something dangerous. The 911 calls. The earlier emergency calls added another layer. According to records cited in media reports, Proano had contacted 911 multiple times asking officers to check on his mother. He believed something bad might be happening. Police responded. They checked the situation. And the calls did not result in evidence of the emergency Proano feared. These calls could be interpreted in different ways. They might reflect genuine fear. They might reflect a troubled family relationship. They might reflect Proano's reported mental health difficulties. They might simply be background information unrelated to the killing. Investigators could not know which interpretation was correct without examining the full context. But the calls did tell them something important. Proano had previously brought police into the family's affairs. His concern about his mother was not entirely new. And his relationship with Jorge was part of that family environment. A mental health history enters the case. Proano reportedly told investigators that he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had experienced auditory hallucinations. This information was potentially relevant to understanding his state of mind. But it also created a danger. Once mental illness enters a true crime story, there is a temptation to make it the explanation for everything. That would be irresponsible. Millions of people live with mental health conditions without committing violence. A diagnosis does not predict murder. A hallucination does not automatically produce criminal behavior. And a person's mental health history does not establish whether they are legally responsible for a specific act. The legal question, if mental competency or insanity becomes relevant, is far more specific. What was the person's mental state at the time of the alleged offense? Did they understand what they were doing? Did they understand the consequences? Did they understand the difference between lawful and unlawful conduct under the applicable legal standard? Those questions belong to forensic evaluation and the courts. For investigators, the immediate task remained much simpler. Follow the evidence. The difference between motive and proof. The investigation now had a possible motive. Resentment. A strained relationship. A belief that Jorge had interfered with Proano's access to his mother. But investigators needed to resist the temptation to treat motive as proof. Motive answers. Why might someone do something? Evidence answers. Did they do it? The distinction is fundamental. A person can have motive without committing a crime. A person can commit a crime without anyone understanding the motive. So the investigation had to keep moving. The physical evidence had to connect to Proano. The surveillance footage had to connect to Proano. The phone data had to connect to Proano. The witness statements had to be assessed. And the timeline had to make sense. Reconstructing the night. Investigators began building a timeline around the known events. Jorge was reported missing on August 4th. His belongings remained at the residence. His vehicle remained there. A suspicious blood-like mark was found near the property. Surveillance footage showed a man moving suitcases. The footage reportedly captured activity investigators associated with the handling of human remains. Proano's phone was reportedly in the area during that period. The phone later appeared along the route associated with the discovery of the luggage. Before midnight, 3 suitcases containing Jorge's remains were found. Then, on August 5th, Proano was arrested. The timeline was powerful because it was chronological. But chronology alone is not enough. Investigators needed to determine what happened inside each gap. What happened inside the house? Perhaps the biggest unanswered question was what happened before the cameras captured the suitcases. The public information available does not establish every detail. That means there is no responsible way to describe a precise confrontation that has not been publicly documented. We can say what investigators believe the evidence indicates. We can say that Jorge disappeared. We can say that his remains were later found. We can say that investigators identified Proano as the suspect. We can say that surveillance and phone evidence reportedly placed him in relevant locations. But we cannot claim to know every word spoken inside the house. That uncertainty matters. Because the final moments of Jorge's life deserve accuracy, not invented drama. The most haunting questions may therefore remain unanswered. Did Jorge realize he was in danger? Did he know the person who confronted him? Was there an argument? Did the violence happen suddenly? Did he attempt to escape? Or was he attacked before he had any chance to react? Only evidence capable of answering those questions should be treated as fact. The aftermath of the killing. Investigators were also interested in what happened after Jorge died. The separation of the remains. The 3 suitcases. The movement of the luggage. The disposal locations. Those actions suggested that whoever was responsible did not simply leave the scene immediately. There was a period afterward in which the remains were handled. That created opportunities for evidence. Every time a person touches an object, moves through a space, opens a suitcase, enters a vehicle, or travels along a road, they potentially leave traces. Investigators could search for those traces. And they could compare them with Proano's movements. The disposal process may therefore have provided investigators with some of their strongest evidence. A killer might believe that moving a body makes the crime disappear. But movement can create a trail. The 3-point connection. By this stage, investigators could see what might be described as 3 central points. Point 1, the residence. That was where Jorge lived. That was where investigators found evidence suggesting something had happened. That was where the surveillance footage captured activity. Point 2, the suspect. Jose Proano had a family connection to Jorge. His relationship with Jorge was reportedly strained. His phone was reportedly located near relevant locations. He was identified by investigators as the person of interest. Point 3, the suitcases. 3 pieces of luggage containing Jorge's remains were discovered nearby. One reportedly had a family connection through the name of Proano's mother. Surveillance footage showed a man moving luggage. The phone data reportedly followed the same general geographical pattern. 3 points. Residence. Suspect. Disposal site. The investigation was trying to prove that those 3 points were not separate events. They were parts of the same crime. The arrest. On August 5th, the investigation reached its first major legal milestone. Jose L. Proano was arrested. He was accused of first-degree murder in connection with Jorge's death. The arrest represented a dramatic change from the uncertainty of the previous day. But legally, it was only the beginning. An arrest means law enforcement believes there is sufficient basis to accuse someone. It does not mean a court has found that person guilty. That distinction must remain clear throughout the story. Proano became the accused. Jorge remained the victim. And the evidence would eventually have to be tested in court. No other suspect. Authorities also indicated that they were not searching for another suspect in connection with the killing and that there was no continuing threat to the community related to the case. That was significant. It suggested investigators believed the event was not the work of an unidentified killer moving through the neighborhood. Their focus had narrowed. The investigation had moved from who could have done this to can we prove that this person did it? That is a completely different phase of a homicide investigation. The case against Proano. By now, investigators believed they had assembled a compelling combination of evidence. A victim. A location. A possible bloodstain. 3 suitcases. Human remains. Surveillance footage. Phone data. Witness accounts. A family conflict. And an identified suspect. The case was beginning to resemble a chain. But a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. If the video identification failed, investigators would have to rely more heavily on other evidence. If the phone data was too imprecise, they would need additional proof. If witness accounts contradicted one another, prosecutors would have to address those contradictions. If the defense could offer an alternative explanation for the luggage, the movements, or the digital trail, the prosecution would have to answer it. This is why homicide investigations take time. The police may believe they know what happened. But belief is not the final standard. Evidence must survive challenge. The questions that remained. Even after the arrest, several questions remained. When exactly did Jorge die? What was the precise cause of death? What happened inside the residence? Was there a confrontation? What role did the alleged family conflict play? Did Proano intend to kill Jorge? Or did the situation escalate unexpectedly? When were the suitcases prepared? Were they obtained specifically for the purpose of concealing the remains? Or were they simply available? How long did the disposal process take? Were there additional people involved? Authorities said there was no other suspect being sought. But investigators still had to determine the full sequence of events. Every unanswered question represented another piece of the story that prosecutors might eventually need to explain. The silence after the arrest. There is often an emotional shift after an arrest. Before the arrest, families may feel that no one is being held accountable. Afterward, there is a different kind of uncertainty. The suspect has a name. There is a booking record. There is a charge. There is a courtroom. But the victim is still gone. For Jorge's family, the arrest could not reverse anything. It could not restore the ordinary life they had lost. It could not erase the image of the 3 suitcases. It could not change the fact that an elderly man remembered by neighbors for his kindness had died violently. The arrest could only begin the legal process of accountability. And that process would demand something difficult. Patience. Evidence would be reviewed. Arguments would be made. The defense would have the opportunity to challenge the allegations. The prosecution would have to prove its case. And the court, not the police, not the media, and not the public, would ultimately determine guilt. The next question, why? The investigation had answered one question. Jorge had not simply disappeared. It had answered another. Investigators had identified a suspect. But the deepest question remained. Why? Was this about resentment toward Jorge? Was it about access to Proano's mother? Was there an argument that escalated? Was there a longer history of conflict? Did mental health issues play any role in Proano's behavior? Was the killing planned? Or did something unexpected happen? At this stage, the evidence could suggest possibilities. But possibility is not certainty. And the difference between those two words is the difference between responsible storytelling and speculation. The case moves forward. By August 5th, the investigators had crossed an important threshold. They had moved from discovery to accusation. From evidence collection to legal action. From an unknown killer to a named defendant. Jose L. Proano was now facing a first-degree murder charge. But the case was not finished. In fact, the most difficult stage was still ahead. The investigators would need to strengthen the timeline. Prosecutors would eventually need to explain the evidence. The defense would have an opportunity to challenge the state's version of events. And the court would have to examine whether the allegations could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The story of Jorge's death had begun with a missing person report. It had passed through a blood-stained fence, a silent camera, a digital trail, and 3 abandoned suitcases. Now it was heading toward a courtroom. But before justice could be discussed, investigators still had to establish one crucial thing. How all of these pieces connected to one another. Because the next breakthrough would not necessarily come from a dramatic confession. It would come from the moment when separate fragments of evidence began to form one unmistakable picture. And when that happened, the question surrounding Jose Proano would become impossible to avoid. Was he simply connected to the tragedy, or was he the person responsible for it?